Hello, this is Jim Mitchell, and we're back from another episode of Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get right into it. First, we have The Quiet Part Out Loud, Iran is more important than America, posted by Jedi Porcupine, and that's a cross post, that's a screenshot of a truth from Donald Trump, who proved the United States is the largest oil producer in the world by far, so when oil prices go up, we make a lot of money, but a far greater interest and importance to me as president is stopping the evil empire, Iran, from having nuclear weapons and destroying the Middle East and indeed the world. I won't ever let that happen. Thank you for your attention to this matter, President Donald J. Trump. And the OP added, so much for being the America First peace president who promised no new wars. And I guess I would agree with the OP on that one. Donald Trump, he said, let's put America first and no new wars. But, when he gets in office and suddenly, he's Israel first and let's stop Iran from building a nuclear weapon, which didn't he just do that last year? It just goes to show you that, politicians will say one thing on the campaign trail, but then they'll do the opposite when they get in office, and Trump is definitely not an exception to that, I would say. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have easy-to-use solar panels are coming, but utilities are trying to delay them, from NPR.org, posted by Ninja Lover, and that's a cross-post from the NPR subreddit. And, yeah, personally, I think if you want to use solar panels, I think that's fine. But, I don't think the government should be trying to, regulate solar panels, just like I don't think the government should be trying to regulate any form of energy. With that being said, of course, Reddit, they only like solar panels since they're more in-group coded than out-group coded. They would love if the government was trying to regulate a source of energy like nuclear power, which is more out-group coded, and I think that's important to remember as well. Next, we have the Trump administration just declared all foreign exports unfair, from Reason.com, posted by Jai Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I don't think they should be doing that, but ultimately, as I go over in pretty much every episode of this podcast, they have the legal monopoly to justify enforcing whatever they feel like. If they want to justify saying that and enforcing that all foreign exports are unfair, ultimately, they have the ability to do so. Next, we have Trump officials didn't plan for Iran to close the Strait of Hormuz, from CNN.com, posted by LegayoX. And yeah, personally, I think they probably should have planned for Iran to do that. It's if a country is getting bombed, it's probably going to justify authoritarian measures like what it has access to, and Iran can do that. Can close the Strait of Hormuz, which is where most of the oil comes out from the Persian Gulf. But if the Trump officials didn't plan that, well, ultimately, maybe they're just not that smart. The government. They're always. I know a lot of Redditors say we gotta have a progressive government in there so they can make all the correct decisions. But ultimately, I would say that ultimately the government doesn't really know much more than the average American citizen does. Ultimately that's why I think we should have as small a government as possible, because when you try central planning, you're only gonna screw everyone over because you don't know what everyone needs on an individual level. I think the libertarian position is each individual should try and focus on their own needs rather than forced collectivism like we have currently. Because when you try and like bomb Iran and you don't consider the consequences of that, it just goes to show you that it's not right for the government to be making all these decisions in the first place. Next, we have the post-Charlie Kirk right is at war with itself. Libertarians are the odd target, from Reason.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I don't think the right should be going after libertarians, but ultimately, the left isn't much better in that regard. The left has an ability right now to reach out with to attract some disaffected libertarians and MAGA types, I would say, but they're just squandering it. I was browsing Reddit recently, and there was this comic from the Pizza Cake. She's like a very archetypical Redditor type, and she was like, and it was her saying, and then she was talking to another woman, and then she said, oh, we should try and find common ground with MAGA, and then she was like saying, and then she said, oh, there is no common ground. That's just crazy. or something like that. And, that's Reddit for you. Trying to find any common ground is considered fascism, and that's why I think the libertarians definitely shouldn't be trustworthy of the right, but they definitely shouldn't be trusting of the left either, because the left's entire platform at this point seems to be let's alienate as many people as possible, and I don't think that's going to bode well for them, especially in the upcoming election. What Reddit thinks there's going to be a blue wave this midterms, and I think to some extent it probably will be, but I don't think it will be nearly the extent that Reddit thinks there will be because of how obnoxious blue-pilled people on social media are, I would say, especially Reddit. Next we have Pete Hegseth says the sooner David Ellison takes over CNN, the better. In slamming outlets report that the Trump administration underestimated Iran's attack impact on Strait of Hormuz from posted by Variety.com, posted by Ninja Lover, and that's cross-post from the entertainment subreddit. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position is, CNN is already irrelevant. If MAGA wants to take it over, like they did CBS News, they should be able to. But I think it's interesting, Reddit is never critical of legacy media when their side holds it, like the George Soros or Piero Midyar or J.B. Pritzker leftist billionaire types when they control the media, but suddenly when MAGA takes control of the media, legacy media, suddenly it's the worst thing ever. And just goes to show you, they don't have any values, only teams. They're like, believe all the trusted sources. And it's interesting, they think this government's the worst thing ever, but the guy who posted this article just shared an article from NPR, which is technically run by the government, National Public Radio. So ultimately, I think, the legacy media is just going to circle jerk establishment narratives, and that's why it's increasingly dead in the age of social media. So I don't think this really matters if it's more of a MAGA or woke type who runs it. Their day is already come and gone, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have Trump and Vance promise no new wars. What happened to that? From Reason.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, personally, as I said previously, politicians will say one thing on the campaign trail and then do the opposite when they get in office. Reddit might say this wouldn't have happened under Kamala, but look under Biden. You had the U.S. getting involved in a proxy war in Ukraine, and all this Israel Mideast chaos started under Biden on October 7th, 2023 as well. So I think that's important to remember as well. Reddit, if Kamala was the one bombing Iran currently, Reddit would probably be making excuses for her, and it just goes to show you that they have no values, only teams. Next we have wearing all black at protests makes you guilty of terrorism. Trump DOJ prosecutor tells jury, and that's an archive link from The Intercept, and that's posted by Tom 13. And yeah, personally, I don't think that should be the case, but ultimately the government has the monopoly to enforce whatever it wants to be when it considers words like terrorism. Ultimately that the government definition of any word is up to their own discretion. Terrorism is a big word I would say in that regard, and that's personally why I think terrorism is ultimately like all these words, every word to some extent is ultimately going to be a subjective term rather than an objective term, and that's personally why I don't think you should be labeling anyone who disagrees at all as a terrorist. But I know if Reddit was in charge, any right-wing protest at all would be considered terrorism, and I think that's important to remember as well. Next, we have anti-ICE protesters accused of being part of Antifa found guilty of support for terrorism in Texas. Case was seen as major test for the First Amendment and whether the U.S. could use broad anti-terrorism statute to prosecute left-wing prosecutors or protesters. From theguardian.com, posted by Ninja Lover, and that's cross-post from the law subreddit. Personally, I don't really care for that, but I would agree that, the U.S. shouldn't be justifying people, locking up people for peacefully protesting. With that being said, of course, Reddit is always going to try and bend things to its narrative. I'm sure these people might not have been peacefully protesting. They might have been, this comment says, This comment goes into it. He says, while I'm lying, I don't know about terrorism charges, but calling the protesters and amateurs is ridiculous. They arrived at the detention center at night and soon began vandalizing property and setting off fireworks. They came with a supply of weapons, which they left in their vehicle, except one of the rifles, which was used to shoot, and hit a police officer. One of the protesters was standing in the woods with an AR-15 and hit him a police officer in the shoulder. The demonstrators brought a cache of weapons. Are just incredible lines to read. And I guess I would agree with that. If these were out-group protesters, right-wing protesters, they would be right. Right would say, oh, these are right-wing rioters. They deserve to be thrown into jail. But since they're more in-group coded left-wing protesters and out-group coded right-wing protesters, Reddit thinks, oh, they didn't mean any harm. They shouldn't be going to be thrown into prison because they're more in-group coded than out-group coded. As I said numerous times, it really doesn't matter what people do. It matters who does what, especially in the age of social media and people constantly looking out for their own team. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Alabama is threatening to ban utility-scale solar, posted by Woke Boogeyman, and that's a cross-post from the Renewable Energy subreddit. And yeah, as I said previously, the government shouldn't be involved with energy policy. If people want to do utility-scale solar, they should be able to, especially if it's on their own property. But I don't think the government should be supporting it one way or the other. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Trump set to receive $10 billion quid pro quo kickback for mandating TikTok deal. Corrected title from WSJ.com, posted by Woke Boogeyman. And that's across the board from the law subreddit. Trump administration set to receive $110 billion fee for brokering TikTok deal. And yeah, ultimately, the government as a whole is pretty much just a giant grift, and Trump's just the best example of it. But I'm sure if this was a left wing, if it was a left wing president in power right now rather than Trump, Reddit will be justifying it or downplaying it, and that's very much how Reddit works. It's just like we talked about the protesters in Texas who were charged with terrorism. If they were right wing, they would be labeled as rioters, which I would argue is probably the better label since they were vandalizing property and did shoot a police officer. But ultimately, it just comes down to who's in the in group, who's in the out group a lot of the time, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Chile's Democratic Socialist President Gabriel Boric, who left office on Wednesday, said his country would become a graveyard for free market capitalism. His movement was buried instead, posted by Socialists Are Morons, and that's a tweet from Reason. And yeah, personally, I do agree that I do like the new president cast. The final election was him. He's a member of the Chile's Republican Party versus a member of the Communist Party, and I'm sure a lot of woke people on this suburb would have voted for the Communist. Because, they practically are communist. That's pretty much your average Redditor is a woke communist at this point who wants woke communism. It's basically if the average Redditor seems to be Joseph Stalin at this point, if he was constantly bitching about his pronouns, and that's not something I personally care for. I don't really care for the Republican Party of the United States, but I definitely probably would have voted for the Republican Party of Chile in that election. And it just goes to show you that, Reddit's probably going to be constantly bitching about this guy, just like they constantly bitch about Malay in neighboring Argentina. But, they were completely fine with Gabriel Boric and his socialist authoritarianism because, Reddit doesn't care. Reddit only cares about authoritarianism what has the wrong ideology or letter next to its name. They don't get that they'll always justify socialist or communist authoritarianism regardless of how bad it is. I'm sure if Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge happened today, Reddit would justify all that genocide. And it just goes to show you that Reddit is completely a lost cause at this point. I was on another subreddit, the Libertarian Party USA subreddit, and this one guy said, Redditors are brainless. I said that might be being too generous of them. Reddit tends to be the modern scarecrow from The Wizard of Oz. If only they had a brain. It's a great reason why this website will be spared if a zombie apocalypse ever does break out. Next, we have So We're Fighting for Israel, not the U.S., posted by Jedi Porcupine, and that's a screenshot of a truth from Donald Trump, who proved Iran had plans of taking over the entire Middle East and then completely obliterating Israel. Just like Iran itself, those plans are now dead. President Donald J. Trump. And yeah, personally, they might have had plans, but I think Iran's kind of in the North Korea category of, they talk a big game, but I don't think they really have the ability to back it up. And so I definitely don't think the U.S. should be bombing them because, they're not really doing it for themselves. They're doing it for Israel. As the OP said, they're fighting for Israel, not the U.S. This is primarily Israel's war rather than the U.S., as are a lot of the past a lot of post-World War II conflicts are in that regard, especially a lot of the Middle East conflicts, I would say, are should be Israel's priorities rather than the U.S. And it just goes to show you that, Reddit, I don't really agree with Reddit on a lot, but I definitely do agree that we need to stop doing Israel's dirty work And that's one of the rare things I would agree with Reddit on. And but ultimately, they'll still call me a fascist for disagreeing at all. As I talked about earlier, with the Pizza Cake comic, it doesn't really matter that they're right on this one issue, because they'll still call me a fascist for disagreeing with them at all. And that's why I'm personally not going to vote for their party anymore. Next we have Meta spent $26.3 million lobbying for age verification bills in 45 states. The bills don't regulate social media, they regulate your OS, posted by Amogus Devilman, and that's a cross post from the anarcho-capitalism subreddit. Meta wrote the laws. The laws don't apply to Meta, don't apply to Meta. And yeah, just go to show you that, private interests are always going to be the ones who are really dictating and writing the laws. I remember back during the early 2010s, the Tea Party and the branch of the Republican Party said the big problem for our government is big government. Well, a lot of people in the Occupy Wall Street movement of the Democrats said no, it's big business. And in reality, we're dictated by a consortium of big business and big government. And you can throw other things like big media and big pharma as well, I would say. And that's just how you gotta hold them all. You gotta realize it's a big club and you ain't in it, as George Carlin famously said. And I think that's very much the libertarian position. Next we have protesters in Cuba attack Communist Party office, posted from NBCNews.com, posted by socialist or morons, and they added down with the tyrants. And yes, I would agree with that. Personally, I don't think you should be attacking government property. You might get yourself into trouble. But I definitely do agree that, sometimes measures do have to be taken when you're dealing with an authoritarian communist government. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have FCC Chairman Brendan Carr implicitly threatens the licenses of broadcasters who run unfavorable war coverage from Twitter.com, posted by LegioX. And that's a tweet from Brendan Carr, who tweeted, broadcasters that are running hoaxes and news distortions, also known as the fake news, have a chance now to correct course before their license renewals come up. The law is clear. Broadcasters must operate in the public interest, and they will lose their licenses if they do not. And frankly, changing courses in their own business interest, and says that trust in legacy media has now fallen to an all-time low of just 9%, and our ratings disasters. The American people have subsidized broadcasters to the tune of billions of dollars by providing free access to the nation's airways. It's very important to bring back trust into media, which has earned itself the label of fake news. When a political candidate is able to win a landslide election victory after it's in the face of hoaxes and distortions, there's something very wrong. It means the public has lost faith in confidence in the media, and we can't allow that to happen. Time for change. And I personally would agree with a lot of what Brendan Carr is saying there, but I don't think the government should be mandating that the private companies should have to face regulations or risk losing their licenses. As he himself said, the American people have already pretty much lost all the trust in legacy media, and Trump won in spite of them. So I think the libertarian position is, we shouldn't have any licenses for broadcast TV, but ultimately, let them die in irrelevance rather than look like an authoritarian trying to take away their licenses, I would say. Next we have Obama is correct. He's not wrong. Posted by Donald Key, and that's cross-post from the Sip Seat subreddit. And that's a picture of Barack Obama. It says, Barack Obama says 80% of the world's problems come from old men hanging on and refusing to step down. And yeah, personally, I guess I would agree with that. But, Obama, he might have been old when he was in office, but he was a tyrant as well. But, of course, Reddit always excuses his tyranny because he has the right letter next to his name. And I think that's important to remember as well. Reddit's constantly bitching the U.S. bombed a school in Iran recently. But, the U.S. bombed a hospital under Obama's watch. And Reddit's kind of memory hold that. So I think that's important to remember as well. Next we have Brian Doherty, History of the Libertarian Movement, dead at 57 from Reason.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I don't know too much about this guy, but I guess it's sad that he died, and hopefully I wish his family condolences. Next we have Mamdani wants to cut NY estate tax threshold to $750,000, hike rate from Bloomberg.com, posted by socialists or morons, and they added, fuck this authoritarian piece of shit. And I'd agree with that. Reddit, of course, will defend whatever Mamdani does. The top comment right now says, for previous Mayor Eric Adams backloaded the prior budget, which is going to fuck the current mayor, no matter who they were and what party they belong to, and states legally have to balance budget, so tax hikes are going to be largely unavoidable. But, of course, so it's interesting, I'm sure if this was a Republican mayor, you're probably not going to get a Republican mayor in NYC anytime soon, based on the trajectories. You did have a few recently, like Rudy Giuliani, and I think maybe Michael Bloomberg. I think he was a Republican for his first term before he transitioned to independent. But, if this was a Republican mayor, Reddit would say it would be calling him out. But since he has the magical D next to his name and is a socialist, Reddit will defend him by whatever means necessary. And that's my thoughts there. Next we have Based or Not, posted by Zivlar, and that's some political tests they took. And yeah, personally, if they want to take any political tests and share the results, I think that's fine. But as they talked about in the previous episode, when they shared a political test result, ultimately all political tests do have an agenda, and I think it's important to stick to your own values rather than whatever a political test tells you your values are. Next, we have decided to try the Islamophobia test posted by Zivlar, and that's their Islamophobia test results. And yeah, if a test wants to label you as Islamophobic, I think that's fine. But I think Islamophobia is just another buzzword people use to justify censoring any dissent at all. It's like racist, sexist, anti-Semitic, homophobic, transphobic, etc., etc. If you want to call anyone who dissents at all any of those labels, I think that's fine. But those labels are also overused at this point. People are tired of it, and it's like when the boy cries wolf for the first time, all the villagers come, but when he cries wolf for the 50th time, none of them do. And that's very much what you see with labels like Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, transphobia, etc., etc. And that's my thoughts there. And let's see if there's anything. Looks like that's it. So we're gonna wrap up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.